again. I already said yesterday for inviting me. I'm glad to be here and found discussions fruitful, and in fact also try to pick up now a few things which were discussed today. The first issue, of course I still stick with my title, the first issue would be one remark on terminology, coming back to this question, liberal and illiberal democracy. I don't know, there is a lot of people not from academia, and they probably do not know this concept of Stephen Levitsky with diminished subtypes, meaning that we have democracy or autocracy, but then within these core concepts we may have diminished subtypes. So if we have a democracy or not depends on free elections, and they meet some degree of fairness. If you don't have those elections, you don't have a democracy and then an autocracy. But at the same time, you can have, in partial regimes, you can have certain impediments to democracies, defects of democracy. So for example, in the state of law, citizens may have problems to defend their rights against the state. In the media, there may be a lack of openness to the public sphere. Horizontal accountability means there is a lack of institutional counterbalance. And also Turkey would be one example, that you have other people who take decisions other than the ones who are elected, for example, the military. And so, I could go on longer than Istvan once with explaining this model. They all contain elements of checks and balances, and the term illiberal democracy now refers to that defect which is linked to political rights or institutional liberalism. So this would be a terminology which is used, and I think it's fruitful to remember this because it contrasts with other ways the term illiberal democracy has been used here. There are at least two. There is maybe economic liberalism or social-cultural liberalism, for example, nationalism, and very conservative family-oriented values. And so we have these two different notions. I would reserve the term illiberal democracy to this institutional element. And here I think it's important that we talk about something like realized institutional liberalism. It's not enough to classify democracy as illiberal if political leaders have only announced things, but they need to be realized in institutional terms. And in that case, now Russia would not be a democracy, it's an autocracy, right? No free elections. Turkey would probably be a liberal democracy, and since we have, in a way, all come here to discuss Hungary, Hungary, I've heard different things here. You have talked of failed illiberalism, but Benedict, for example, seems to be talking more of Hungary like Turkey. So, in fact, we are fighting in a way, or we're discussing if these announcement of the liberal policies have been realized in the institutional sphere. This turns me to the question: does public discourse in Europe as a whole now refer to democracy, and to what type of democracy? Liberal, a real or ideal? And here we can remark, this has been said many times, that liberal democracy is understood in Europe and the EU in a specific sense. Right? It's a market economy-driven process. And the common market was at the core of it. There is a lack of social Europe. There is a very, very diminished welfare dimension. And now the problem is, with the Growth and Stability Pact, the Eurozone, and so on, some countries, or some societies, one might say, are more crisis-resistant than others. This is the problem. It's not only about Germany and Greece, I would say, but you can see the difference if you compare Poland and Latvia. Poland is not, it's not in the euro, and so it had the possibility for a few months, 6 months, 1 year, to devaluate the currency and to somehow steer its own course. If you are a economically developing country within the EU framework, like Latvia, if you have opened your banking sector towards the EU, and you don't have if the crisis hits, you don't have an important instrument to resist this crisis is absent. So this market economy-driven liberalism, which the EU stands for, is a problem in times of crisis. It's not a problem, in times of non-crisis, but reaction to crisis is a problem. And then one other thing which has been said, are we dealing, we're talking about European values, and Lorenzo, for example, we were talking about values a lot, but also others. And there is sometimes a tendency, and this is up for discussion, of course, that discourse refers somehow to the values, to ideals, which are in theory or in ideal world nice to follow, but which in national contexts usually have been moderated or they have been negotiated. Yeah, for example, majority against minority rights. In many countries, let's take France, for example, there is a specific trade-off between minority and majority rights. Yeah, think of rights to use their own language. But there, we are used to the fact that it's a negotiated situation. But once we get to the EU level, we don't have this idea, and that's why we have a tendency to refer to ideal norms and somehow forget that they need to be negotiated. And if this diagnosis is true, I would formulate that there is a certain problem both EU actors but also civil society actors have, namely bringing an ideal market economy democracy in line with the social market democracy which is expected by most part of the voters, of European voters, in national context. So we have a double problem of adjusting ideas to real-world decisions. Well, is the EU a democracy? This is another question. If I get the topic which is suggested, is the EU a democracy? It's probably not a democracy. Yeah, it's constituted of national democracies. There are common democratic values, not only Article 2 and 3 of the EUV, but also other core documents. But there's limited democratic institutions with regard to the fact, for example, that the European Parliament has not a say in all policy fields. It has to negotiate with an executive, which is called the Council, and so on. Therefore, European studies, which I teach, has not really used analytical categories which are linked to democracy. But it's other terms. It's governance, it's EU integration, and it's Europeanization. And to be short and also to sum up, I want to have two final remarks on integration and Europeanization. And it has been said that there is an erosion of the normative power of Europe. You said it, but I'm not sure. And this term is used with regard to the EU being attractive, let's say, for future member states, for example, for Turkey or for Ukraine and so on. But I think there is also a decline of normative power within the EU, and with regard to the idea of sovereignty transfer. Should sovereignty be transferred to EU institutions? There are two distinct developments. One is, I think, that by and large, German and French governments and presidents today have become more like Sweden or the UK or Denmark, maybe in the 80s or 90s. That's the idea that there may be a problem to democratic self-government if you just give it away to Europe. It was not existent in Germany, and it was only to some extent existent in France, for example, Mitterrand. He was one of the architects, think of Delors. They were architects of Maastricht and of further treaties. And so since we had at this time the idea of a German-French engine maybe for further integration, it's quite easy to explain why things are different today. Because simply elites in Germany and in France are as focused on democratic self-government as the UK and, for example, Sweden have been in the past. The second development, those program countries, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and so on, had to face the risks of economic and monetary. Yeah? Today's government has to face the risks some previous governments haven't seen or which they have not really looked at. And so this means that the real existing model of market liberalism as we have it in the EU has shown in the crisis distributive effects. Because when you do not have monetary union, a country can devaluate if the competition is low. Yeah, this is what Italy did many times. This is what France did during a certain time, and this devaluation, it hits the whole of a people, yeah, of society. Because also people who have money on the bank, they lose it. It's devaluated with regard to the dollar. But if you don't have this, it's a certain part of the population which suffers. Those who have work. Those who have capital, I mean, real people who have capital on their banks, they have not suffered. They have maybe even gained. In relative terms, they have gained. And this is the distributive effect of the Eurozone itself. And this is another reason why European integration has, of course, somehow lost attractiveness. Yeah? So this is my point. Intellectual and real attractiveness of the idea of sovereignty transfer have suffered. And so if we now turn from this ideal democracy in Europe to the real world democracy, I think what we have to criticize is not only the liberal democracy, but to some extent liberal democracy. Liberal democracy as it has been set up in the EU, because it has certain distributive effects which we are only allowed to learn. I can maybe speak which we are only beginning to learn. I can say this for the German public. Integration was something, you should strive for it. It's beyond any question. It's a taboo to be anti-integration in Germany until today. But what we're learning now, that further integration may not be the only way to foster democracy. Cohesion policy, we have heard this. Cohesion policy, which is an element of integration, actually helps in the liberal government. Benedict even said it's held up there. The government here is held up because of the EU. Monetary union fosters this content, not only in Greece, but also, let's say, in the Netherlands or in Germany. So monetary union is certainly something, it's instead of integration, which is bad for democracy. And you could also say that the Schengen regime makes accountability very difficult in asylum policy, and might be easier in the national context. So one lesson for me is in a way that democracy could also be regained by disintegration. I'm not talking about a political wish. It's not something I personally want, but theoretically, somehow this idea of connecting integration and democratization has been severely hurt in the last 10 years. Yeah? And Eurozone crisis is as much an element of this as the organ government.